Okay, I hope everyone can see that well. I've got 30 minutes. That was the guideline, and I'm trying to do too much, so I apologise in advance. I'm unpacking really the project that I'm doing at the moment because I do think it deserves some kind of explanation about the direction I've gone in and its relevance and applicability to classics. So I'm going to be trying to talk about far too much. I mean, to start off with thinking about the sense of touch, and then talking about sensory studies and sensory impairments and why we might want to and really should incorporate people with sensory impairments in the study of the senses, because basically my argument is because it makes it much more interesting. Going to think about touch in museums and art appreciation and the history of both, and then start focusing in on museum access for people with sensory impairments. What's actually happening in museums today? Well, not today, but when there isn't a pandemic on. Then I would finally start focusing on the Tiresias project at the British Museum and a couple of small scale courses that I've done with blind and partially sighted people there. I'm going to talk a little bit about touch description, which is very embryonic, early days at the moment, but I think maybe of interest. And what I won't have time to talk about is the use of touch in communication. And this is particularly the case with British Sign Language, I think. It's actually sort of part of the grammar and syntax at times. So I think you just get a sense here that touch is kind of it gets into all corners of art appreciation. So touch is a universal and it's absolutely fundamental, and it's essential for all sentient life. And it's a bit of a poison chalice, this, because it also means that it's kind of so widespread that it's mundane, it's kind of unworthy of comment, it's taken for granted. I think the recent volume edited by Perbs on touch and the ancient senses is a very useful introduction to this, and also some work on modern neuroscience, which really emphasizes how touch is emotive. It really is core to kind of being human, and has a role to play certainly in art appreciation. Here I'm showing a quote from Fiona Candlin, and this is to do with the relationship that touch has with other senses. And she says, oculocentric learning and its correlative forms of professionalism have been predicated upon a separation of sight from a broader sensory conceptual matrix. But this does not mean that touch or the other senses have ceased to operate in this context. And I think that this sort of multi-sensory approach is absolutely vital, and it's one that's recognized in audio description, which is the verbal description of visual art. And good audio describers will make sure that they are referencing all the senses and not just the visual, because they are perhaps ironic, but if you talk to blind and partially sighted people, they are acutely aware that all of the senses are kind of jumbled up together. So sensory studies and sensory impairments, and you'll all be aware that sensory studies is big news in archaeology and classics. It's really kind of taken off as a sub-discipline. A little bit slow to the table was the involvement of people with sensory impairments. And there is an issue perhaps of this being problematic because it's anachronistic, and I don't have time to really offload what I feel about this issue. You can bring it up in the Q&A if you want. But there is a school of thought that thinks that you can't study disability in the ancient world because it's a modern word, it's a modern concept, so it's therefore anachronistic to apply it to the ancient world. I don't agree with this for a number of reasons. You certainly have people with impairments operating, moving, breathing in the ancient world. And I also am not convinced by some arguments that are sort of doing the rounds at the moment that the reason why there isn't a category of disability is because everyone was fully absorbed into mainstream society. I think that sounds like it's a bit too inclusive and progressive for the Greeks and Romans that I know and love. I suspect that they're not mentioned and, you know, visible to us because they were incredibly marginalized, which is kind of the opposite. So the charity model of disability is one that everyone would be aware of. It's the kind of sense that you should help disabled people because they've drawn the short straw, and you know it's just nice to help them out and so on. This has had a massive switch in Britain anyway, and many other Western countries and indeed non-Western countries. In 1995, we have the introduction of the Disability Discrimination Act. And so this makes it a human right to have certain provisions and support mechanisms put in place. So it shifts from being a gift that you very kindly give to a disabled person to actually being a duty that you have to do by law. And since the 25 years of the DDA, so it's shifted again in a sense of being more proud in disability, of really making the case that you have a different life, a different experience, not lesser, to not really focus on what you're missing, but what you can contribute or what your experiences can contribute. And this is known as deaf gain or blind gain, that, you know, okay, you've got an impairment, but you gain other strategies and ways of thinking instead. So I've been thinking about the benefits of exploring this in museum space and considerations of new forms of art appreciation and modes of communication about the art. I will also just reference going back to the volume on touch in the ancient senses, and Rebecca Fleming's chapter in there is very interesting because unusually for this series, and it's an excellent series, it's got a chapter on impairments. And if you think of sensory impairments, you probably first and foremost think of deafness and blindness. Touch impairment, I think, is a very serious one as well. You can literally, it's a bit crude, but if you're missing your hands, this is the main form of haptic perception. Paralysis is a form of touch impairment. Numbness and pain is, you know, if you've got chronic pain, then that is a serious, has a serious disabling effect. So touch in museums and art appreciation, and the mantra is do not touch. It's, you know, really drummed into us. And Fiona Candlin, again, quote from her, she says, access programs and participatory art tend to situate touch as an immediate, intellectually undemanding and communal activity, whereas for early 20th century curators, touch was related to instinct and expertise. And for 18th century visitors, handling was part of a rational empirical investigation. And of course, these days in museums, touch is, on the whole, restricted to blind and partially sighted people. And that's an important point for when we come to talk about touch description. So museum access for people with sensory impairment. And when I talk about art appreciation, I mean two things really. I mean the actual perception, the registering of the artwork, and also the communication about the artwork, because museums are social spaces, and on the whole, not just in education, but in general life as well, part of the point of engaging with artworks is then to critique it and talk about it and things like that. So I think the mode of communication is something that really interests me as well. And here we've got a variety: audio description, the kind of translation from the visual and other senses to the verbal, or known as ekphrasis in Greek studies. I've looked at this in a different talk, and because it's all online, I won't go into that here. Touch tours is another form of interaction with art. Captioning services, ironically, I mean, this is my personal favourite, but it's not really that interesting to think about. But British Sign Language, which is a spatial visual language, many deaf-led BSL tours are run in London and further afield in the UK, either interpreted into BSL or given by a deaf tour guide, and using a language that relies on space and vision grammatically and for syntax when you're talking about artworks is absolutely fascinating. When you sort of switch back into English, it's like putting a straitjacket on because everything is linear and not the same at all. But that's really another talk as well. I don't have time to go into that. Part of blind game, deaf game, I think, is to take these strategies and to ask whether there are wider benefits at all, whether hearing and seeing people might also benefit from these amazing strategies that have been developed. Types of touch for blind people in museum. There's a lot going on out there. Touch is often incorporated into audio description, audio described AD sessions. You have handling sessions of originals or replicas. What you can see here is one of the kind of 3D raised paintings that have been developed. This is Van Gogh's Sunflowers in Amsterdam. And we also have copies of casts in room 18B at the British Museum. And sometimes tour guides for blind and partially sighted people will bring along materials that the artwork's made of, or the tools that we use to make them. You can have braille provision, that's a form of touch. Very small proportion of blind people actually know braille. It's a bit like BSL and the deaf community. On the whole, it's a small proportion who knows BSL. Raised line drawings is something I'll talk about in a moment. And then the problem of independent trips. You can kind of sit someone down and give them things to handle and stuff, but are they going to be able to navigate the museum independently? That's actually pretty tricky to figure out. The V&A have started introducing various ways that this might be done. Raised line drawings consist of a special paper with alcohol bubbles in it, sort of plasticky, not very environmentally friendly stuff. But if you draw over it with carbon and put it through one of these infrared devices, then when heated, the carbon parts will raise. And these have had a mixed response. Popular in some sessions. So, for example, I've been to a couple of the National Gallery Art Through Words event for blind people, and there you get a really big raised line drawing of the painting that's being discussed, and it seems to go down very well. But we must remember that this does not aid the user to see with their hands, and this was an assumption that was made at the beginning of access provision. The idea that you could kind of trace the drawing or artwork with your fingers and that would create a visual understanding. It doesn't work like that. It's perhaps more successful in representing 2D art rather than 3D architecture and art. In fact, Scrapler, perhaps it's definitely more successful in representing 2D art. So finally, we get to the Tiresias project in the Parthenon galleries, and you'll notice the date here, 1998. So this is shortly after, 3 years after the Disability Discrimination Act was passed. So the British Museum were, doing cutting edge stuff, really trying to think about how to enable access for blind and partially sighted people. This space here, if you think of the main Parthenon gallery in the British Museum, and this sort of very grand hall-like structure, it's got two auxiliary rooms to its side. one of these is specifically created for blind and partially sighted people. So quite an unusual example of a space being designed with this target audience. You can see in the foreground the touch model, and also on the two sides you can see the copies of the cast of the West Frieze that the British Museum has, and you are allowed to touch these. The image that you see here is before the great revamp that just happened in the space. It opened and was amazing and wonderful, and then the museum shut because of the pandemic. So it is very new and fresh, so it's quite exciting to compare the two. Another part of the Tiresias project was this big volume here, second sight of the Parthenon frieze, and the late great Ian Jenkins was involved in this project. You can just about see the braille that's underneath the printed English that's done throughout the volume, and also all of these images are raised lines. So in theory, you're meant to be able to trace the images. In fact, it doesn't work like that at all. It was a bit optimistic in how this would be received, and feedback from blind people has indicated that it's just too complicated, just a massive raised lines, can't really make it out. Accompanying this book is, you get it with CDs of the audio description that goes with the book, all 5 hours plus of it. It's, you know, it's Ian was reading it out, so he had a lovely voice, and it's very nice to be taken through. But the word on the street these days is that audio description should be about sort of 2 to 3 minutes long. So it was a bit expansive in feel. So this is the project. It's, I mean, I think you have to bear in mind that as often when something is really a pilot, it's going to try doing things that don't work out so well, like with the raised line drawings. This is a photo I took. You can see it's a few months old, but you have a cat and a dog to show the scale. It's a really big book. I mean, it has to be to get any sense of detail there. And one thing that this can lead us to think about is how the, actually, I'm just going to pop back actually, because what you see here on the pages, you've got the strips of the frieze just running throughout the book in order. And on the top, you've got raised line drawings of the main figures. There's shaded background to help highlight the figures. The vast majority of blind, partially sighted people can see something. Only 4% are completely blind. It's quite unusual to be completely blind. So if you've got sharp contrast, it can help to get this sense. And at the bottom, you've got these figures of what they've done is kind of unwrap the different depths of field so that you can understand from a bird's eye view just how the figures are overlapping one another. This doesn't really help blind and partially sighted people. The feedback, you know, was a bit disappointing about how this helped them understand or conceptualize the composition of the frieze. But I find it really fascinating to think of the frieze like this. And if we go to the center of the East frieze, this is another raised line drawing that I've done, where you have the gods seated on the two sides. They're the larger figures, and then in the center you've got these 5 human figures, and at the bottom you've got the kind of suggested depths of field, how they're overlapping each other. I'm sure many of you are familiar with attempts to make sense of this rather strange arrangement, because the humans are kind of breaking up the gods, and they're in the very center of the east side, taking the kind of prime spot, which is also a bit weird. So various people have sort of rethought how the composition of this part of the frieze might have looked like. So here you have deities in the line at the back and your 5 human figures in the front. So it can be really useful to kind of think of but even very, very well-known images, but from different perspectives. And I think you know, this is a byproduct, an unintended byproduct of the Tiresias project, which is useful, I think, for thinking with, even though it did unfortunately sort of miss the target audience of blind people. So I'd say one argument that could be made is just by rethinking about how to reproduce or recontextualize or reconstruct artworks and compositions for someone who has a sensory impairment. You can sort of get to understand it better yourself. This is the beginning of the North Frieze, and I've sort of selected this slide because you can see that there are 5 depths of field, and this looks very much like a sheet of music. And indeed, Ian Jenkins was very good at talking about the musicality of the Parthenon. He talked about sort of symphonic metaphor of, you know, where you've got the crescendos and the quiet parts. It's all interesting stuff. So just to compare before and after the recent revamp that was done in this space, the old space was really quite gloomy. It was quite dark, and these days it's lit so much better. Bearing in mind, of course, that, you know, don't think that blind people are expecting everything to be dark. Most blind people can see something, so you want it to be as well lit as possible. And I've marked up all of the areas that you can touch in this space. The other thing about the revamp is, in the old room there was no notice board up telling you that you could touch the copies of the cast. So it was actually, I was very nervous to do so, even though I knew that you could. You could easily have a guard that wasn't aware that it was allowed and get told off and humiliated and the rest of it. So it's quite good that it's got that notice up. And obviously you can't touch the ancient remains like this area here. It's just the cast and model. So before COVID, I was running access courses for blind and partially sighted people, very small groups, because of the nature of the exercise. There was an access element, a service element of, you know, wanting to introduce people to the Parthenon. It was done over a series of sessions, so it wasn't a one-off talk, because I wanted to get to know the people. And also I got different audio describers on board to try out different styles and types of AD as well. So I was able to observe and get feedback from these people, and focus on interaction with art using AD, raised line drawings and touch tools. And also the development of touch description, which I've say didn't get very far, and definitely needs a lot more work. But the idea here is sighted people provide audio descriptions to blind people as a form of access. Blind people are allowed to touch things that sighted people aren't, so why can't they develop touch description to provide access to sighted people? This gives more agency. This kind of gives a bit more sense of, you know, being not just a passive receiver all the time. And this has been advocated by some blind scholars as well. We'll come back to that in a moment. So combining AD with raised line drawings, various different types. You can do it with 3D, 2D, and objects with 2D images on them. So let's have a quick look at some. This doesn't work very well. It looks dreadful, that doesn't matter. This is a raised line drawing of the Acropolis of Athens. And you can see, you know, that the Parthenon is a big rectangle. These don't work very well at all. Reproducing architectural space in this way just doesn't sort of translate. This is much more productive when you have a painting or something and you have raised line drawings of that. So at the top right, you've got the so-called sunshine sandwich, the or sunlight sandwich, the audio describer describes it as. At the bottom, you've got the placement of the figures. And when you're giving an audio description with something like this to work with, it works much better. Here, with the handling sessions with Greek pots, here's a Parthenon vase. These were very useful as well, because you can, really enjoy picking up a vase, but you can't actually really depict what's happening on the vase. And I did two different ones here. On the left, you have as you see it on the vase. On the right, you've got it as it would look like in real space, and this is the vase itself. And the unanimous preference was for the one on the left, the one where it actually looks like the vase. And this will remind some of you of the sort of unrolling of Greek vases that William Hamilton with Tankerville did in their monumental publication. So one thing that we can think about is whether, well, touch for sighted people, we know it's popular, it's very difficult to stop people touching things. And touch exhibits in museums, even when they started off being, just for blind and partially sighted people, have kind of ended up becoming more universally enjoyed. So the Please Touch exhibition at the British Museum, 1983, one of the really early ones, was open to all, intended for blind people, and there was some unease that it sort of got taken over by sighted people. We also have handling desks for everyone, handling for elderly people and pensioners. It's sort of interesting side interest, this happens outside the British Museum as well. That it becomes popular throughout. Just going to go very quickly because I can see time is moving on. So just to think again about who the viewer is, who is appreciating the art, because what I'm doing here is engaging with people with sensory impairments to get their sort of impression of the artworks. And there is some discussion about whether this is a valid methodology, but we're all decolonizing things these days, so different sight impairments have different impacts, which is something to bear in mind. And also there are other variations as well. Stereo blindness is a really interesting one, I think, where you kind of see the world as flat. You don't have any sense of depth. And blind gain as well, that I've mentioned. I recognise this, I recommend this book by Susan Barry if you're interested in stereo blindness. And the RNID, their motto is see differently, not see less, not see, it's shifting the value thing. It's actually quite important shift, I think. I quite like it. I'm going to skip over this because it's from my other talk, but this is the arguments given for audio description being used for sighted people as well, and how it actually helps people really get into the artwork better. But what I want to do is to focus on touch and this issue of touch description, which hasn't yet taken off. Articulating touch is really difficult. It's challenging, like describing pain. It's a private, intimate and subjective sense, so it's particularly resistant to language and description. But if touch is fundamental to sensibility, then how can art discussions occur without this? And can a touch description be developed equivalent to AD? And can blind people lead on this? I've sort of had a go, and it's really difficult to do this. I think probably commissioning poets is the best way to take that forward. Just to briefly mention that this is a project that is working very much with feedback from people. So in addition to the course with blind and partially sighted people at the bottom there, also done a course with deaf British Sign Language people, thinking about how you just engage with the artwork differently when you're using BSL, and English. And also these events, Access All Senses events, which are for mainstream people, but introducing audio description, touch and British Sign Language to them, and seeing whether the museums could be more inclusive by actually rolling this out to more people. Controversial subject, because it is important to kind of ring fence access provision and make sure that you're dealing with the people, target audience, correctly, but one that I want to explore. So here we have the course and the touching of the copies of the Parthenon, and I'm going to shamelessly mention this book again, which Hannah mentioned at the start. There is a chapter in here on the audio describe side of how things are at the moment. Anyway, it's all quite work in progress. But I need to finish, and I want to finish with the rather assertive and this is the activist mantra: nothing about us without us. So if we are going to look at disabled people in the past, and some people would say we can't and we shouldn't even try, but if we are going to do that, I really think that we need to involve present day disabled people as well. I don't think that, as with all human groups, it's great to kind of objectively study people without involving their personal voice and input as well. So, and to think about whether we can really expand our understanding of human perception and beholding by taking a much broader idea of who the viewer is and how they are communicating. Tiresias project is a great kind of focus, because it has changed over time. It's been sensitive to feedback and adapted to that. I personally, I'm deaf myself, and I was mainstreamed as a child, so I'm very pro integration rather than segregation. And having more access in the mainstream so that everyone is exposed to it is something I'm personally keen on, but there are problems with that. I also am very keen to build a bridge between academia and museum access work, because it's very common for academics to collaborate with curators, but museum access staff have a lot of experience and interesting insights as well. And there is, in fact, an access network that I run for them. So finally, it just leaves me to thank the organisers so much for organising and inviting me to this seminar, and various individuals who deserve thanks as well.